Carrie Stevens, an assistant professor of English at the University of New Mexico Gallup, and I am presenting on The Emergence of Winged Things, Avian-Centered Memoirs as Arenas for the New Ethology. This slide shows a selection of covers of some avian-centered memoirs: Saving Jemima, Wesley the Owl, A Rage for Falcons, and The Parrot Who Owns Me, coming down in counterclockwise order. It is hard to know what to call memoirs centered around the sharing of life with an animal, hence the somewhat awkward locution Avian-Centered Memoirs in the title of this paper. Cynthia Huff and Joel Hafner, in their article on autobiographies centered around animals, use the name animalographies. However, the definition for the term is confusing even in this article. Huff and Hafner define animalographies as, quote, work in which humans reconstruct their own subjectivities in the voices of animals, end quote. However, this does not leave a name open for the other kinds of texts their article discusses, such as memoirs clearly and unequivocally written in the voices of humans sharing the life of an animal. It is also not clear that there is a definition for memoirs about species other than dogs under the animalography umbrella, despite Huff and Hafner's thoughtful argument about what is lost when humans try to speak for companion species. This near-exclusive focus on dogs is not a surprise to the reader. It is evident in the title of Huff and Hafner's article, His Master's Voice. However, Huff and Hafner do mention companion species and companion animals at numerous points, as well as, quote, dogs, cats, and the other species we call companions, end quote, thus indicating that, in fact, their concern for other than human voices is at least meant to extend beyond the canine. I mean in this paper to take up some of that slack, expanding into an area less touched by animalography articles, and which is even more vexed, involving as it does companion species that are not domesticated, that are not furred and four-legged, and that can sometimes speak to humans in voices that echo our own, tangling up questions of kinship in controversies inapplicable to dogs. One notable thing about avian-centered memoirs is that the process of kinship involves making kin, to borrow one subtitle of Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble. Unlike dogs, birds are not mammals, and thus without the outer indications of physical, evolutionary kinship, like hair, that dogs call to mind for humans. As well, many of the birds these memoirs center on, while tamed, are not domesticated. This has a number of consequences that affect the relationship between bird and human, as we can see in The Owl Who Likes Sitting on Caesar, Martin Windrow's memoir, who I have the cover of here, a man sitting across a table from a tawny owl. Martin Windrow says when discussing birds of prey, quote, it is widely understood that a truly social animal, such as a dog, can easily be trained to regard its human owner as the alpha dog of the pack. A solitary hunting bird, a raptor such as an owl, feels no such instinctive connection, end quote. That lack of connection also means that the bird feels no desire for human approval in the way that a dog does. The human cannot resort to disciplining a bird with a sharp tone, and also cannot assume that a bird desires to be petted in the way that a dog might. Instead, the human must use, in Windrow's words, careful kindness, with the understanding that even a careless gesture can set back the bonding process. While the specifics of Windrow's taming process are most relevant to owls, the familiar companion birds, parrots, require the same habituation to humans and individual taming processes with each generation. Ornithologist Joanna Berger also stresses that parrots are not feathered dogs. Quote, dogs have been bred to seek approval from just about anybody. Not parrots. You must go slow. Trust must be earned. Parrots want to make their own friends at their own speed. Pushing them provokes fear or aggression, end quote. The process of kin-making is thus made more difficult, both by the difference of birds' evolutionary heritage and by the informed human's awareness of what it will take to win avian trust. While the idea of a pet relationship may seem to make the animal part of the family, to employ a phrase often used to describe dogs and cats, it is not so simple with a bird. Carrie Wolf notes that, quote, what could be called the logic of the pet is the principle of symbolic sacrificial substitution, except in reverse, end quote. A special animal is chosen from all the rest, while the rest go to slaughter, in animal shelters, for example, and that special individual becomes part of the human owner's family via a seamless adoption process. In Avian-Centered Memoirs, however, the emphasis rests on the bird's choice and the fact that the adoption process is often anything but seamless. Making kin with birds is difficult, challenging, always a source of wonder and delight. Falconer Stephen Baudio calls the, quote, education of the falconer a chastening process during which you learn to be polite to an animal. You reward the companionship of a creature that could disappear over the horizon in 15 seconds flat, end quote. The difference of birds from dogs means that avian-centered memoirs are also constantly churning sites of kinship creation, a different genre entirely from animalographies in which dogs reenact a familiar family narrative. The authors of these memoirs, in fact, tend to emphasize birds' alienness rather than their familiarity, especially in the beginning portions of the narrative. This slide shows the cover of Cy Montgomery's Birdology, a number of hens against a blue background on a tree branch, and this book functions as a mini-memoir with 7 chapters, each showing an encounter with a specific type of bird. In it, Cy Montgomery says, as this slide shows, quote, we don't even think of birds as animals, although they are, as are humans, of course. We consider animals to be our fellow mammals, with whom our kinship is obvious. A bird is as distant from us as a dinosaur. But unlike the extinct monsters of the Jurassic and Cretaceous, birds today are everywhere among us, on our sidewalks, at our bird feeders, on our dinner plates. Yet despite our disparate evolutionary paths, scientists are now beginning to reveal the extent to which birds' emotional and intellectual abilities are remarkably like ours. End quote. It takes work to look past the obvious kinship with mammals, and even the impulse to apply the word animal to mammals alone. I've already referred to how the name animalographies, in at least one article, is largely confined to stories of relationship with furred, four-legged companion species. There is also a blog in the history of the animal rights movement that begins, quote, most people would agree that a dog has more sentience than a kitchen table, end quote. Ethologist Franz de Waal discusses how easy it is for people to appreciate his work in animal cognition, precisely because it takes place with apes, our obvious kindred. Quote, since I work with chimpanzees, bonobos, and other primates, people usually don't give me a hard time when I speak of cognition. But why stop at the primates when considering cognition? End quote. Writers of avian-centered memoirs have not stopped at the primates, or at mammals. But the overwhelming perception in our society that mammalian companion species and our most closely related kin are the ones worth paying attention to is one that these avian-centered writers must both struggle against themselves and lead their readers past. Accordingly, emphasizing the alien nature of birds to humans, as Montgomery does, is a rhetorical tactic that acknowledges the idea of separation and makes the seeking of kinship both more difficult and more wondrous. Acknowledging the practical difficulties of living with a bird is also a large part of these memoirs. It adds to their veracity and enables the text to move beyond mere recounting of anecdotes by incorporating the scientific basis for these inconveniences. During a time when even such popular companion species as cats have demands heaped on them to be clean about their droppings so as not to inconvenience their owners, it goes against the trend to admit in writing, as Martin Windrow does, that, quote, since it is impossible to house train a bird, that meant that I would have to accept natural accidents with a degree of equanimity. In short, that there was bound to be a fair amount of owl crap around the place, and I had better get used to the idea, end quote. Birds interfere with the writer's kin-making work of writing the memoir as well. This slide shows the cover of Mozart's Starling by Lyandelin Haupt, a starling against a blue background with green accents. While the last year has seen people apologizing for the barking of their dogs or the abrupt sight of a cattail on their Zoom screens, apologies do not encompass the admission of lateness and lost work that ornithologist Lyandelin Haupt begins her memoir Mozart's Starling with. Quote, as this slide shows, this book would have taken me half as long to write if it were not for one fact. Most of it was composed with the starling perched on my shoulder. Sometimes she was nudging the tips of my fingers as they attempted to tap the computer keys. Sometimes she was defoliating the post-it notes from books where I had carefully placed them to mark passages essential to the chapter I was working on. She would stand there in a cloud of tiny pink and yellow papers, with an expression on her intelligent face that I could only read as pleased. She pooped on my screen. She pooped in my hair. End quote. This excerpt, like Windrow's, conveys the better get used to the idea that, while perhaps pertaining most directly to the issue of feces, also applies to other aspects of life with a bird. Not amenable to discipline or house training, birds have to work together with humans to find a lifestyle that suits them both, at least if the humans are serious about making kin. Incorporating these aspects of a bird's biology allows Avian-Centered Memoirs to also welcome deeper discoveries about the ethology of feathered creatures. And, as can be seen in the quotes from Windrow and Haupt, the tone remains one of humor and openness, rather than sharply closed exasperation that would cut off receptiveness to the interesting facts of scientific discoveries. Haupt's motivation for adopting her starling, Carmen, to better understand what it is like to live with a starling, so that she might also understand what it is like for Mozart to live with one, leads her to also research discoveries about starlings' grasp of syntax and grammar. Haupt cites the research of Tim Gettner, a neurophysiologist at the University of California, San Diego, who has studied starlings' responses to created languages of bird-like sounds, and their ability to recognize repeating, recursive grammatical patterns in these languages. Haupt finds Gettner's research fascinating, and comments, as this slide shows, quote, "Here we are talking about the acoustic recognition of syntactical patterns, a linguistic ability. So if birds and humans can recognize the same patterns, why and how would we draw a line between them? And as a starting place for intellectual discourse, why would we? It seems far more expansive, more respectful of our complex intellect and the potential scientific secrets residing within the bodies and brains and lives of the creatures with whom we share the earth, to respond to such a study with our minds wide open, with a sense of curiosity and adventure." End quote. Haupt's sense of adventure was not shared by all the scientists responding to Gettner's paper, some of whom showed shock at the idea that starlings, a bird despised in North America for its effects on crops and native species, could grasp grammatical patterns. This emphasizes the importance of avian-centered memoirs and the minds of their writers being open to notions of kinship. Even within the scientific community, not everyone is. Previous studies on this kind of pattern recognition have been done with primates, who, as Dewall suggests, are more acceptable to many people as kindred. That openness to ethological discoveries helps the writers step back from their own rhetorical moves that categorize birds as alien and show the evidence of bodily and cognitive kinship. This kinship can offer, as well as wonder like Haupt's, personal healing for a human whose world expands to include the bird. This slide shows the cover of Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, a goshawk sitting on a branch with one foot drawn up. H is for Hawk is both a memoir of Macdonald's grief after her father's death and of her relationship with Mabel, a goshawk she purchases from a breeder. Macdonald notes the difference between Mabel's eyesight and her own as they stand outside with Mabel on her glove. While Mabel studies the world, Macdonald wonders, quote, "What is she seeing? My brain does backflips trying to imagine it, because I can't. I have 3 different receptor sensitivities in my eyes, red, green, and blue. Hawks, like other birds, have 4. This hawk can see colors I cannot, right into the ultraviolet spectrum." End quote. This takes a known scientific fact about a bird's vision and pairs it with the new ethological acknowledgement that even animals so different from humans as goshawks have a mind behind the different kinds of receptor sensitivities, a multisyllabic, scientific-sounding, distancing word. A brain that connects with the world and interprets, not merely looking, but seeing. Macdonald, at this point in the book, still does not have as much of a connection with Mabel as she will later, and even though she recognizes Mabel's curiosity and interest in the outdoors, calling it, quote, "the gritty intensity of a child filling in a coloring book," all Macdonald can think is, "I want to go back inside," end quote. Later, however, as Mabel's presence offers Macdonald a responsive relationship, in assurance that not all companionship and kinship vanished from the world when her father died, Macdonald adopts some of the goshawk's fascination and curiosity for herself. She sees Mabel, quote, "turn her head upside down as she continues to regard me with the tip of her beak pointing at the ceiling. I am astonished. I've seen this head turning before. Baby falcons do it when they play. But goshawks? Really?" End quote. The the stunning impact of a new fact coming to MacDonald through her own observation. Interestingly, this is a scene where she has just closed a book and looked up from it to regard Mabel, leads her on to imitate the bird's actions. After she tosses Mabel a rolled up piece of paper, she describes the goshawk's eyes as, quote, narrowed in bird laughter. I am laughing too, end quote. From reflecting on the difference between their eyes and wanting to duck away from the environment that interested her hawk, MacDonald has progressed to noting the kinship between those eyes and the similar emotion that animates them. H is for hawk is an exemplar and microcosm of the progress from alienation to kinship in Avian-Centered Memoirs. In his book The Tiger, an investigation of an Amur tiger's deadly attack on a Russian hunter and why it happened, John Valiant defends the importance of, quote, trans-species understanding and communication, having less to do with animals being humanized or humans being animalized than with all parties simply being sensitized to nuances of the other's presence and behavior, end quote. This is the path that leads to kinship, the acceptance of animals and humans sharing similar traits while coexisting in acceptance and acknowledgement of difference. For some animals, like dogs, that understanding may be assumed or not elaborated on because they are so familiar to us. Science journalist Abigail Tucker, commenting on the prevalence of dogs in literary writing, says, quote, dogs are born characters, and we understand each other to the extent that our tales are the same, with beginnings and endings, long distances traveled in between, and death waiting obediently at the end, quote. The stories of humans and birds, however, like my parrot Alex pictured in this slide, are not congruent unless we make them so. And then, for all sorts of reasons, from our distinct evolutionary heritage to the general unfamiliarity of most humans with the avian mode of life, they remain stories of kinship, of similarity rather than sameness. The kind of work that must be done to spin these stories into life makes Avian-Centered Memoirs an excellent vehicle for demonstrating how scientific knowledge and relationships created by lives led in chosen proximity can build a genre wide open to wonder. Thank you. This last slide shows my works cited page.